Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in for yet another episode of the Industry Leaders Podcast. Episode 3 today is going to be about ways to use science to change lives and create physiques that last. And we're going to be talking with Luke Tulloch, who is joining us now. Thank you, Luke, for joining us today. I'm really excited for today's chat. As I introduced you earlier, we're going to be talking about how to use science to create physiques that last. But before we dive in deeper into that, can you give our listeners a little bit more insight about who you are and how you entered the fitness industry and what you're working on today?
Yeah, no worries. Really nice to be here. I'm glad we could make it work with the time zones and that sort of stuff. So I'm from Sydney. I'm a personal trainer. I have been for 13 or 14 years or something like that. And I started in your typical commercial gym, and now I work completely online. But along the way, just kind of like to study a lot, really enjoyed the science side of things. So that's why we're talking about that today. I got a degree in neuroscience along the way, and yeah, now I live in Sweden. I coach people online, and the main thing I'm kind of interested in, I guess, is how we can use science to make fitness a bit better, a bit easier to understand. But I don't really like to make it too complicated these days. I think I made that mistake earlier on in my career.
Yeah.
Having things a little bit overly complex, and it's really not that usable. So now we want it to be usable stuff. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Awesome. And we're excited to be able to hear your thoughts, methods, and everything that you have to say about nutrition and training. A lot of our listeners are aspiring PTs or people in the industry looking to grow in the industry. So we love being able to pick your brain. So we're going to dive into talking about what your specific approach to training and nutrition looks like at the moment.
Yeah. So I guess, like I mentioned, it is science-based, it is evidence-based, but there's a real sort of art to applying that as well. And so I really think that our practice should be sort of rooted in evidence, but evidence doesn't just mean studies. It means practical experience. It means looking at what other people have done. And it also means applying it in the right way to the person in front of you, right? So for me, it's kind of like, where can I find the meeting point between all of these different factors and then apply it from there? And like I say, I think in the past I maybe made the mistake of looking exclusively at studies and trying to put that straight into practice. And that has a lot of different problems with it, namely like there's an individual in front of you, but also because, studies themselves also have some limitations and that kind of thing. So we kind of have to learn what studies are telling us, but then be able to apply it as coaches in practice. And so that's kind of like my main focus, and certainly try to use that with my clients, try to use that with myself, try to have discussions about that with other coaches, because I think we can all kind of bring something to the table with our own experiences and that kind of thing as well.
Yeah, and I think, you brought up a good point about, there are a lot of studies and that we're continuously being provided with a lot more science and education. And we evolve as coaches, right? As new studies are coming out, there are methods that we might have disproven, right? That things that we used to do that now are proven to not be as effective or as efficient. And I think as coaches, it's really important, yes, to educate yourself and, stay up to date with the sciences, but also you mentioned it is very individualized. That's one of the things that a lot of the people in the fitness industry, when we've chatted on the podcast, really bring up the fact that when you're working with your clients, they're human beings and everything is very individualized. So although, the basics of your training and nutrition can be applicable, you have to be able to adapt and adjust to the individual that you're working with. Now, when it comes to specifically chatting about making physiques last and using science to ensure this, many of our listeners who are coaches and PTs want to find the way to maximize the results for their clients, but also make it last. So what would be maybe your top 3 things that you could recommend coaches to implement for their clients to keep these physiques lasting?
Yeah, totally. So I think probably the first thing that I really like to look at is just general habitual behavior. So the idea here is that a lot of our underlying behavior that we perform every single day is subconscious, like 50-60%, right, according to research. So, obviously if you're sort of unaware of what you're doing 50-60% of the time and it's just kind of happening on autopilot, then there's a lot of ground to cover there. So, I mean, you
Yeah.
can be really conscious and trying to be perfect with a lot of your behavior throughout the day, but unless we kind of address some of those habits, it gets really, really hard.
Yeah.
Um, so, with that in mind, I really sort of try to promote this idea of practicing with my clients. There's these moments of kind of mindfulness and awareness of what they've been doing and sort of introspection. And so, okay, this first tip is, it doesn't sound really like, well, what study did you get that out of? And
Yeah.
um, it's not quite the same as like, this is how much protein you need to eat and that kind of stuff. But fundamentally, if we want to have any of those sort of scientific interventions of like, this is how much you should train, this is how you should eat, this is blah, 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 hey, to implement it, this is the first step. You really got to get on top of that sort of stuff. So I think probably my first thing is really just start to build awareness around your behaviors. Look for the contexts of what prompts a behavior. So habits are basically like, there's a cue, we
Hmm.
then do a behavior, we then get a reward, and that reinforces the behavior. That's kind of the fundamentals of it. So if we can kind of understand what the cue is in the first place, then that really helps. And that could just be like a quick who, what, when, where, why kind of
Yeah.
analysis. And you might find, okay, every time my client's stressed, they decide they want to go for the chocolate. Awesome. That
Yeah.
gives us an entry point to start using some of our evidence-based strategies to counter that or whatever it is. So that's kind of my first thing. That's always my first principle. And then from there, I think from a sort of science-based perspective, there's a lot of nuts and bolts that we can go into with, like I said, how much protein do you need to eat? How much sleep do you need to get? All of this kind of stuff. And so it can get a little bit convoluted. And my sort of way of thinking about things is to go, okay, well, what's the biggest return on my investment here? If I'm going to
Yeah.
invest time and mental effort and maybe some money into some stuff, like what's going to give me the biggest return, and let me go after that stuff first. And so it comes down to some of these fundamental things that we all kind of talk about as trainers. Hey, let's eat enough protein. Let's make sure we get enough sleep. Let's make sure we're getting into the gym and training regularly. Maybe something along the lines of like just being generally active,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So, from there, that gives you a good platform to build from. So yeah, I guess that's kind of like the entry point, and that sort of idea of having a hierarchy in your head of like, okay, what needs to happen first, and then I can build on that, is a
Yeah.
really helpful tool, I find.
Yeah, and I agree. I find that even within my own coaching, where if I have a client come to me and they set a goal, right? We, instead of, it's great. I love hearing their goals, but then we talk about, all right, what actions or behaviors are needed to get you to that goal? Set that as your daily goal, your weekly goal. If you start focusing and putting in the attention and effort into the habits and the behaviors that get you there, the results will come. But when you start telling your client to constantly focus on that end goal, that's great. But when they're not seeing progression towards that weekly, or they're not seeing it as drastic, then they start getting very frustrated. But when we focus a lot more on the behaviors, which is a big thing because you're working with humans, and I think it's really hard when we're working online, if you don't have this method nailed down properly, it could be very tricky because, as you know, it's not the same as in person, right? Being able to communicate with someone. So it really is, there's like that barrier that you need to cross, and, talking on the phone, whatever it may be. But I love that you're bringing up the fact to focus on behaviors. And that's a really powerful tool to help yourself reach your goals and your clients reach goals as well. What would you say would be like the things that you see people do often that are wrong when it comes to their nutrition and approach to training, that you wish they could have had a more different approach?
Yeah, honestly, there's 100% agree with what you said. By the way, I'm a big one on like process orientation and like, hey,
Yeah.
just stick to your process and the stuff. The results will come, right?
Yeah.
Um, in terms of doing stuff wrong, I really think that probably almost like the inverse of what I said before, where really focusing on some of the stuff that doesn't give a great return on investment. So
Yeah.
I suppose getting really detail oriented, and this can be challenging as a coach, because when someone comes to you and they're like paying you a lot of money maybe, and they obviously view you as an expert, and you want to show off your expertise, one of the mistakes that I made earlier in my career was like, I would jump down my client's throat with like, oh, here's what supplements you need to take, and
Yeah.
these specifics about meal timing, and like really, really specific with tempos and this kind of stuff
Yeah.
with the training. And it's not to say that stuff doesn't matter, because it can 100% make a difference, and,
Yeah. Agreed.
for sure. But like that stuff's going to really give a pretty poor return rather than getting some of the basic things right. So again, if we can go back to a hierarchy and go, right, well, uh, sure, I can focus on my meal timing, but ultimately, if I haven't found some way to just eat an appropriate amount of energy every day, regardless of what method I use, whether it's if it fits your macros or paleo or keto or whatever, then fundamentally the meal time is not really going to do too much.
Yeah.
But if I can get that sort of calorie load appropriate in the right ballpark to start with, then I can build on that and go, cool. Well, now I can chase down my macro ratios, and now I can chase down my nutrient timing, and then I can think more about supplements and that kind of thing. And so I see a lot of people that come to me and ask me questions on social media that are kind of trying to major in the minors, so to speak,
Yes, I hear
which
that
is
often. Majoring in the minors sometimes can set you up for failure, especially if you haven't
100%.
mastered the majors.
That's it. Yeah, totally. And I mean, sometimes it's kind of boring, but
Yeah,
honestly, that stuff, like I say, it gives you the biggest bang for your buck. And then it actually lays the platform for you to then almost, I don't want to say earn the right, but in a way, yeah, earn the right to,
yeah,
okay, now I can chase down the details, and they're actually going to be a lot more effective. So
yeah,
I think that that's probably what most people get wrong, because maybe it's just because they're getting excited around the science and the mechanisms and stuff involved in
yeah.
training and nutrition.
Yeah, and it's very, when especially if you're getting a client that is a beginner, they may look to you and are ready to do whatever it takes, right? Whatever little itty bitty thing that you have as your toolkit of knowledge to provide them the success that they need to see. But I think, like you said, setting those foundations, if they're able to master that, then you can start implementing the next level of intricacy or process to their daily routine. And it's something that you can also chat with your client at the very beginning, saying, okay, we're going to keep it simple at the beginning. Your first couple weeks, we're just going to focus on, mastering your nutrition and moving your body. As simple as that. And right, sometimes that could be very frustrating for a client that really wants to see their reach their success really quickly. And that's just a part where, as a coach, you have to really, keep them grounded and understand that what is your goal? What is the realistic timeline? Here's what we need to do before you can't just jump right into the deep end. Unfortunately, you have to really be able to take it step by step, and that's something that you have to work with directly with your clients. And that's when you develop that trust with your client. They're supposed to trust you with this process, and at the end of the day, once they're done working with you, they're going to be able to continue lasting with the results that they reach, right? That's the whole point of being a coach. I find that within my own purpose, and you can share yourself. My goal is to educate my clients so that when there comes that time when they're not working with me anymore, they feel confident to sustain and continue reaching their goals, right? You're not going to end up training a client for the rest of their lives. Some maybe here or there you might, but that's the ultimate goal.
Yeah, that's massive. And so there's
Yeah.
this concept in the literature of self-efficacy, right? And so self-efficacy is a psychology term that they use in the psychology research. And it basically amounts to like, how confident do you feel to solve any problems that come your way,
Yeah.
essentially. So yeah, just your confidence to handle whatever comes your way.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's ultimately what we want to instill in a client. And interestingly, I think sometimes you get a little bit afraid as a coach, maybe if you um I'm not sure anyone like consciously like tries to hold their clients back so that they stay
Oh
with
yeah.
them, but you still have that in the back of your mind, like, at some point I'm going to give them as much of my knowledge as I can, and then
Yeah.
they maybe won't need me anymore. But honestly, I have found that the clients that have been with me for 2, 3, 4 years now ongoing,
Yeah.
they're the ones who I've imparted as much of my knowledge as I can to, and have the most
Yeah.
self-efficacy, but they still stick around because they, like you say, we built that trust and we built that relationship, and they feel really confident and happy in that.
and that built up relationship that you have with your client. I think that's one thing that kind of can intimidate trainers at the beginning of their career. It's that, yes, getting as many clients as you would like to work with, but also retaining them for a long period of time. And that takes work, and that takes a little bit of effort of building that relationship and trust with your client. And at the end of the day, same going back to assessing what their goals are and giving them that realistic timeline of how they're going to reach that goal, what they need to do, and how you're able to help them. And you'll see if that client is the right fit for you. You don't have to necessarily change how you coach if you're believing in like creating more sustainable approaches. If they're looking for something more drastic, you can be transparent and explain to them that maybe you just can't do that for them. I'm a wholehearted believer of making sure that the methods are sustainable, because at the end of the day, health is key, right? Health is a top priority for the clients, regardless what their goals may be. And I as a coach want to make sure that their health is going to be maintained and sustained throughout the entire period of working with me. Now, we wanted to delve into some of the questions from our audience, followers, and fellow coaches that they asked the most. And one of them being building muscle, right? That is one thing that a lot of coaches themselves and clients want to become toned, right? But that requires a phase of building muscle. Is there a checklist that you have to ensure that you are indeed building muscle? So what are certain things that you can go through to ensure that you're doing that properly?
Yeah, awesome. So ultimately, what we're trying to do when we build muscle is we're trying to maximize our muscle protein synthesis and essentially just have that happen frequently enough that it starts to accrue over time. We also want to make sure that our muscle protein breakdown is not too great either. And so there's a couple of avenues that we can take to ensure that that's happening at a molecular level, right? One of them is training. So we want to be doing enough training volume and training hard enough and frequently enough to make sure that we're growing some muscle. We're providing a stimulus there. But we also don't want to train too much, because if we do too much training volume or use too many advanced techniques like tons of drop sets and lots of muscle damaging type stuff, then our muscle protein breakdown starts actually increasing, and we can start to outstrip our muscle protein synthesis. So it's about trying to find that sweet spot where we definitely want to train hard. We want to do a pretty good amount of training volume, but we don't want to kind of overdo it too much. So it's just finding that sweet spot for the client, which will change. You know, like a beginner will need a lot less, a more advanced person might need a lot more, right? So that's kind of like on the training front, that's the main thing I'm looking at there, and just doing that consistently. Then on the nutrition front, there's some obvious stuff, like we want to make sure we get enough protein. I usually shoot for like a minimum of about 1.6 grams of protein per kilo of body weight, which is like 0.72, I think, grams per pound. You don't have to be that specific, but somewhere around there. I think that's a pretty good number for most people. Like it's pretty sustainable for people to hit that amount in most cases, and you can go higher, of course, if you want to. So that's going to help to arrest protein breakdown, obviously stimulates muscle protein synthesis as well. I think then the carbohydrate's pretty important too in most cases. Certainly you can use something like a keto diet or a low carbohydrate diet in some instances, but I think for muscle growth, we really want to make sure that we're getting enough carbs. And this is going to vary a little bit. It depends on the exact style of training you're using and that kind of thing. But having enough carbs around supports training performance, which basically means we get more out of our training sessions, which then means we stimulate more muscle growth and we recover better. So I'm a big fan of getting enough carbs. And so generally would recommend around 3 grams per kilo as a pretty good spot to start from and go up from there. So those are kind of like and then obviously being in a bit of a surplus. So just to kind of get a little technical for a second, on a molecular level, we have all of these different molecular processes going on that sort of combine on muscle protein synthesis. And in the muscle cell, and in every cell, in fact, we have a little energy sensor called AMPK. And AMPK basically can tell what the energy status of the cell is. And of course, building muscle and synthesizing new proteins is a really energy intensive process. Not only are we going to build all of this new tissue, but then we have to maintain it, right? So our body's not going to build that muscle unless it absolutely knows that it's going to have the energy around to support it. And so if we're in a calorie deficit or we're doing an excessive amount of exercise and we don't have enough energy around, then it's much less likely that we're going to get a ton of muscle protein synthesis, because this energy sensor is going to go, oh, hang on, not enough energy available, and put the kibosh on our muscle protein synthesis. So being at like energy maintenance or a little surplus is also pretty good. And then there's a bunch of lifestyle stuff that influences this stuff as well. Your
Yeah.
stress management and your sleep's like pretty massive. And there's a super interesting study actually talking about muscle damage, where the researchers measured the level of psychological stress that people were under and how quickly they healed from various types of wounds. So, like scrapes and cuts and that kind of stuff. Now,
Interesting.
on a molecular level, the sort of same process occurs whether you cut yourself or scrape yourself or whether you induce muscle damage from training. The immune system is recruited in the same way. The same general process happens where damaged tissue is broken down and rebuilt again. And what they found is that the more psychological stress, the more life stress that people were under, the slower they healed from these wounds.
Yeah.
So we can kind of extrapolate that to muscle damage as well.
Yeah.
And sometimes, this is where I kind of go, okay, this sounds a little bit weird, but sometimes having a hobby or like planning a night in front of the TV or like getting a massage or having a warm bath or going out to the pub with your mates, like that stuff can actually have a tangible effect on how much muscle you gain.
Oh, I
So
agree. I
that's
agree.
interesting, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree. I'm currently in a competition prep. I'm going to be stepping the stage in 2 weeks. And that's one of the biggest things, especially in a competition prep when I'm trying to maintain as much muscle as possible while being in a deficit. Stress is at an all-time high. And that's one of the things that I'm very grateful for my coach, who always makes sure to prioritize checking in, where is my stress at, right? Because if I'm not fully allowing myself to recover, my body's taking a toll, and not only mentally, but you could see it physically as well. And stress causes a lot of issues. And I think too many times people neglect it and think just training and nutrition good. They don't think about their sleep. They don't think about the things that can help, decrease your cortisol levels, let you calm down. It doesn't have to be something expensive. It doesn't have to be like full Zen mode, but you need to find something that helps you unwind and recharge, because you can't keep pouring from an empty cup, right? If you're not recharging yourself, you can't perform to the best of your abilities and show up to whatever role you play in your life outside of, the work that needs to be done to reach your goals. And it's a big thing that can be tricky sometimes, especially when we can't control our stressors. And I think a lot of times people don't think of training and maybe dieting as a stressor on your body, but it most definitely is. And that's a really interesting study. I've never heard about that study, but that's really interesting that you were able to see that.
Yeah. I mean, you're so spot on with the training and the dieting is like a stressor, and people don't recognize that sometimes. But
Yeah.
you're also 100% correct that sometimes there are stresses that we can't control. Maybe
Yeah.
your boss is a jerk to you one week, or
Yeah.
like you got a young kid and you can't sleep that well, or whatever it is. So in my mind, like, okay, that stuff's out of your control, but what can you be proactive about and what can
Yeah.
you control?
Of
Like you
course.
said, like finding something simple that can help you to just de-stress a little bit. And not only does it actually sort of de-stress you a little, but it also gives you a sense of control and agency back. And
Yeah.
that in and of itself, from psychology research, is actually
Yeah.
a really powerful anti-stressor. So yeah, really
Yeah.
important.
And that too, being in control. I think sometimes if you find your clients being very stressed out with a lot of outside things, and then their nutrition and training is stressing them out. I think one thing that I saw that really helped, because I work with a lot of women, and there's a lot of things outside of their control that they stress about, whether they're moms, jobs, whatever it may be. And I think one of the things that really helps them shift their mindset around training and nutrition is seeing it as a thing that they have control over, right? You have control over the foods you put into your body. You have control over how you're moving your body. And then also control over ways you can alleviate that stress to the best of your abilities. And that can help ground your client and really give them the encouragement of feeling like, although everything else may seem out of control, this is the few things in their lives that they do feel in control. So it's really cool that you're mentioning these things, because I do this all the time with my clients, and I don't even like think twice about that. But it's really awesome hearing that there is a science behind these things as well, and these are behaviors that can help you as a coach and for your clients as well. It's awesome. So now we're going to talk about, we talked about building muscle, but then we have this building muscle and losing fat. That's a very common goal that people may have. What would your stance be when it comes to trying to do these simultaneously?
Yeah, good question. So it is possible.
Yeah.
Now, it kind of depends on a few things. So it's much easier for people who are overweight
Hmm.
or are beginners, much easier to sort of lose the fat and gain muscle at the same time. So if you are coaching a beginner or someone who's like maybe bordering on obese or something, honestly, I think you can easily achieve both of those
Yeah.
things at the same time. You don't have to specifically necessarily go after fat loss or muscle
Yeah.
building first. It's kind of like, let's do both, man.
Yeah.
So that would be that's the start. But as we get more advanced, it does become more difficult to do both. Now, you can actually use the energy from your body fat stores to sort of fund your muscle growth. That
Yeah.
can totally happen. It's just a little slower than if we were to have dedicated cutting and bulking
Yeah.
phases. And because those are quite finely balanced, those molecular processes I spoke about before, we kind of got some that are a little bit competing there if you're trying to
Yeah.
do both things at the same time. The stuff that I mentioned that it's a little bit more detail oriented, like the nutrient timing and the actual macro splits and your supplements and that sort of stuff, they start to become a little bit more important. So
Yeah.
maybe if you're just in a pure bulking phase, like your nutrient timing, yeah, it matters, but maybe it doesn't matter that much. The main thing is just to get the calories in, right?
Yeah.
But if you're trying to do both at the same time, lose fat and gain muscle, then okay, now your nutrient time is going to become much more
Much
of a
more
factor
important.
in that being
Yeah.
successful. So it can certainly be done, but I think it requires a lot more attention to detail. And so that might be appropriate for some people, but it might
Yeah.
not for others.
Yeah, and I think that's like one of the things for example for competitive athletes, whether they're trying to build or maintain muscle while in a deficit. That's why it's really important if you are working with clients, they look up to a lot of these athletes and want to look like them, but need to understand that sometimes we get very meticulous, right? So when it comes down to like the back end of my prep, it is the timing of the food, the supplements, every little thing needs to be aligned. As a natural athlete as well, I need to do the best that I can to really support bringing the best physique that I can. And too many times, we mentioned this earlier, people focus on these little details at the beginning. You just have to make sure that you are the right candidate for that. If your client is the right candidate to be able to handle all of these little checkpoints, if you see that they're very overwhelmed with just the basics, then you need to have still focus on them mastering those basics before you start implementing everything else. um, Everything is individualized. It all depends, right? We get questions all the times as coaches, but it just depends. It really does depend, and you have to listen to your clients' needs and their lifestyles. Now we're talking about losing fat, right? The southern hemisphere is entering summer. Here in Chicago, we're entering winter, and it's not going to be a fun time. But a lot of people in the southern hemisphere are entering their summer season and are going to be looking to lose body fat. Now, when it comes to that, do you have any hacks or fail-proof plans and approaches for fat loss and maximizing fat loss?
Yeah, I feel you. Being in Sweden, it's dark at like 4 p.m. now, so
Yeah.
yeah, I know exactly what you. It's going to be rough, but yeah, the fat loss. I think it probably comes down to really what you're comfortable doing, I think.
Yeah.
So, we're talking about individualization. So I'll give a little tip on something that I find really helpful for myself. I'm not
Hmm.
someone who's like super patient with fat loss. So I
Hmm.
actually go with pretty big deficits for myself.
Yeah.
And the reason I do that is because I find it really motivating. So if I'm like in the zone with a deficit, and yeah, okay, I feel hungry and stuff, but I'm kind of like, I'm in the zone. I am dieting now
Yeah.
and I can see quite rapid changes, then that feels really motivating to me. Um, so typically what you'll find is like the approach is either a little bit more of a moderate deficit, maybe something like 20 or 25%, and you do that
Yeah.
for a longer period of time. Okay, more sustainable, awesome, might suit some people. Other people like me might prefer a more aggressive approach. And
Yeah.
I typically actually do like a 40, sometimes even a 50% deficit for myself, which is like pretty big.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to last that long then. So what I find is really helpful for myself is like if I want to get shredded, it doesn't take me that long because I go really super hard to start with, but I make sure I'm on point with, my
Yeah.
sleep and my stress management and all that sort of stuff. I don't run it for very long, maybe sort of 3 weeks, and then I transition to something that's a bit more sustainable from there.
Gotcha.
And just that little kickstart can be really, really motivating. And we actually see this in research as well. For some people, in fact, for most people, obviously it doesn't apply to everyone,
Yeah.
having a faster initial weight loss period can mean better longer term results
Yeah.
because they get more motivated by seeing those results early on. And
Yeah.
so I have had some clients myself where I've come in and gone, listen, you've got whatever, you got like 30 pounds to lose. It's going to take you some time. So we're going to have to be dieting for like 6 months or 9 months or whatever it is. And to hear that as a client, you're like, okay, like I know it's going to be a bit of a long time, but that's such a slog and that can be really difficult to stay
Yeah.
motivated day to day. But if we can get a rapid initial fat loss and then go, cool, we'll just transition to something more sustainable from there, then that can be a really nice way of doing things. And so that might be something that works quite well for everybody in the Southern Hemisphere. I know, like, especially in Australia, like January tends to be kind of the hottest month. So you kind of go through your little Christmas period and then it's like, sweet, I can hit January to start. I can get a couple of weeks, maybe drop a couple of kilos, and then transition to something a bit more sustainable from there. And that might be a good tactic for some people.
Yeah. And so, if you are taking approaches that may be a little more drastic, how would you navigate, coming out of something like that? You've reached that fat loss goal and navigating, how to sustain that and also not gain it back. I think sometimes it could be a little tricky if we take drastic approaches with some clients, that if they did it very drastically and they didn't properly come out of that, that they may gain that back, and if not more. So how do you navigate doing that?
Yeah, I think there's a few ways you can do it. The first is you could just sort of take a lot of the general habits, but just kind of turn them down a little bit, right? So
Yeah.
if I'm going to go into a 40% deficit, there's a few key things I'm focusing on. Tons of fibrous veggies and lean proteins and that kind of thing.
Hmm.
Staying generally like pretty active with taking walks throughout the day. Like you can still do all of that stuff no
Yeah.
matter how big your deficit is. So you're still like working on all of those habits. And then I could just transition straight up to like a 20% deficit
Yeah.
and just go from there. What you could also do is you could kind of go with these periods of more extreme dieting interspersed with like a diet break.
Hmm.
And psychologically, that can be quite nice for people because it gives them a shorter term goal. So you might be dieting for, let's say, a total of 12 weeks or something.
Yeah.
But if it kind of works that maybe the client diets hard for 3 weeks and then has a week break, 3 weeks, week break, etc., they kind of have these shorter term waypoints along the way that they can just focus on and keep them on track. And so that can be quite a good way of doing things. But if you're going to do things like that, then I think it has to be quite clear to the client, like the initial dieting period is going to be quite challenging. And there are some
Yeah.
things we have to be pretty on point with. And when we transition to the quote unquote easier or more sustainable style of dieting, that isn't like, okay, well, now the foot's off the pedal and
Yeah.
we just get to like relax. It's still a structured dieting period. It's
Mhm.
just a bit easier to stick to, essentially.
Yeah.
So those are kind of the two approaches that I tend to use.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I say, with the diet break, you just got to kind of make it clear that like diet break doesn't mean eat
Eat
whatever you
whatever you
want.
want.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Eat whatever you want and cut exercise entirely. You have to, too many times, and I use this as an example, because I am a competitor myself, in the sense of I see a lot of teammates of mine, they work really hard. It's gas pedal to the floor till getting to show. And then after show, if you don't have a plan to kind of ease off of your
Yeah,
training and incorporating food, it gets to the point where you could create really dangerous habits of like overeating, binge eating, and then putting on a lot of weight, which can hormonally and like physically and mentally can do a lot of damage. So if you are taking approaches with your clients or with yourself that may be more drastic, you have to be very transparent about these periods of time, whether it's a diet break or whether it's a, hey, we're entering a diet phase, but I need you to commit to a phase afterwards so we can get you back to a more sustainable approach so you can maintain it. It's like the diet after the diet.
yeah,
um, what are
that's
your
big. I really like that.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on something like a reverse diet? We hear this term often. Do you use that method of reverse dieting, and what are your thoughts on that as a benefit to sustaining fat loss?
Yeah, I quite like reverse diets. I think it works really well for some people.
Hmm.
For other people, like maybe not so much.
Yeah,
So it really is about knowing your client, and I suppose as you get more experience, you kind of start to see which situations work well for
yeah,
which person. But certainly, I think it can be a nice way for people who have, for example, done all the hard work and gone through a diet and maybe lost some weight and that sort of stuff. And now maybe they're a bit scared to like transition from there. Like,
yeah,
what do I do now? I don't want to keep dieting and restricting myself forever, but I also don't want to gain all the weight back. So what do I
yeah,
do? And so I think the reverse diet's really helpful that way because what you essentially are doing is just edging their food up bit by bit, and it gives
yeah,
them a way to dip their toes in the water to be a little bit more comfortable psychologically. And at
Yeah.
the same time, you're also kind of exploring, okay, how much food extra can their body handle before they start putting on more weight than they want to.
Yeah.
And so I think that that approach can be one way where you're not just guessing, okay, we've been on 1200 calories. Well, I think maybe your maintenance is 1800. So let's just go there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we get to actually test that out bit by bit and see where it is. So, I
Yeah.
mean, one of the disadvantages is that it does take a little bit of time
Yeah.
to do that. So if someone's been in a deficit for a long period of time and you want them to come out of that deficit and remove that
Yeah.
dieting stressor, sometimes it means that it's going to take longer to do that, which might not be appropriate. But sometimes it is actually quite nice psychologically to be able to go through a
Yeah.
reverse diet. So I do use them for sure. I think we have all of these tools available to us, right? And I don't want to discount any tool. I
Yeah.
kind of want to go, where's it appropriate for me to use it? And oh, sweet, this is a perfect situation. I can pull out my, if it fits your macros. Oh no, this
Yeah.
situation is a bit different. Maybe I need to pull out measuring with your hands for portion sizes or whatever it is.
Yeah, and I think that's a mistake sometimes you can see with a lot of coaches, that they find one method that maybe works for them and a good amount of their clients and think that every client needs to do this, right? If it works for one of them, it works for all of them. And unfortunately, that's not the case. You have to be very flexible. And I think with expanding your education, whether it's through courses, through actual schooling, through doing your own research, and you build a toolkit, like a toolbox full of tools, and your goal is to find which tool is right for which client. And you can test these things out. It's okay to say, all right, we tried this doesn't work for you, here's another tool. And that's one thing you can be transparent about, saying there's not one way to do things. So if this doesn't work for you, well, guess what? We have XYZ ready for you to try and see if that's something that works and is sustainable. You have to be transparent as a coach to say that, so that your client, again, trusts you enough to try these things and understand that if it doesn't work for their body, that doesn't mean that they're broken or that your methods are broken. It's just simply that this specific method is not tailored or right for them at that moment.
Yeah, I mean that's so true. And I think if you, like you say, if you're transparent, if you come to a client and say, "Listen, I think this tool will work well for you. Here's why,
Mm-hmm.
but let's try it, and I'm going to really rely on your feedback. And as a team, like we're going to find the best thing that's going to work for you, and
Yeah.
that way we can put our heads together, as opposed to like, no, I'm the boss and I'm telling you what's going to work. You know?
Yeah, and I find that, creating that team relationship with your client really gives them that sense of like accountability. Because sometimes if you're just sending things to your client and just expecting them to follow it, well, you're doing them a little bit of a disservice, because one, you're not really teaching them why they're doing what they're doing, and then they don't really know how to navigate things when, let's say, they can't do it 100%, right? If you're giving them the directions on how to do things, but let's say they don't have a certain ingredient in the pantry, so now what? They just won't bake anything at all. So it's like you have to teach them how to navigate these periods of times when they're not able to be 100%. So I love being able to fill your toolbox with all the tools needed, but you have to know when to use which tool. Now, when we talked about training, we talked about nutrition. One thing we touched on is supplements, right? That's the little nitty gritty part of, adding more things to your process. You speak about them often in your Instagram. So what are your favorite supplements for fit and healthy adults? And what supplements do you see out there that are complete nonsense and a waste of money?
Yeah, I kind of um, speak ill of supplements sometimes because that's often the first place that people go, as opposed to like,
Yeah.
hey, dude, you got to kind of do the work as well. But there's definitely some useful supplements out there, and so we have to go through this return on investment like analogy again.
Yeah.
Some supplements do have an effect for sure, but okay, it's going to cost me a lot of money to buy essential amino acids, so I have to make sure that that's actually worth the investment for me.
Yeah.
For some people, in some cases, it might be, but probably in a lot of cases, it's not. And so for me, I'm trying to look for the supplements that are going to give me a pretty good return on investment. Maybe they're cheap, easy to take, that kind of thing. So for me, the stuff that I really like are things like your classic stuff, vitamin D, especially in Sweden. We don't get too much of it this time of year for sure.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, fish oil if you don't eat a lot of fish. It's kind of like some of the boring stuff, but
Yeah.
your whey protein or whatever. If you're vegan or vegetarian, you want to use a plant protein source or
Yeah.
something. Hey, the convenience, they're pretty cheap, like
Yeah.
really safe, amazing. Now,
Very.
one thing that I really love for pretty much everybody is creatine.
Yes, and I
And
actually get this question often from my
yeah,
female clients, and I want to see what your thoughts are, especially for females that are hesitant to take creatine because of bloating, getting bulky. Let's talk a little bit more about creatine. I'm really happy you brought that one up.
yeah, awesome. It's kind of like simultaneously one of the most well-known supplements, and also like there's a lot about it that people don't know.
Yeah,
So the basically what creatine does is we have these stores in all of our cells, creatine phosphate. So
yeah,
if you talk about like the different energy systems, we have like the phosphate system that you use when you sprint, right? It's like the
yeah,
first 6 seconds, and it burns up all of your ATP and that sort of stuff. Well, creatine basically bumps up your reservoir of like that short term energy source. And so
yeah,
what it does is it actually helps us to perform a little bit better on exercise. So we might be able to get a few more reps with heavy loads,
yeah,
that sort of stuff. But what it also does is it increases your lean mass a little bit. Firstly, because it improves exercise performance, but secondly, because a big part of your muscle size is the stuff that's inside your muscle, the
right,
water and the glycogen and all that sort of stuff. And so if we have a bit more creatine in there, the reason why your body weight might go up a little bit when you take creatine is because it's
yeah,
pulling more water into the muscle, and it's inside the muscle. So when people get a bit scared about bloating, it shouldn't make you bloated. It's actually just
yeah,
enlarging the size of your muscle a little bit. So
yeah,
it's a really desirable thing. The other really interesting thing, though, is because creatine can act as this sort of short term, like energy reservoir, that actually works in other tissues as well. And there's some evidence that it works quite well in neural tissue, so like your brain,
Ooh,
meaning
interesting,
that it
yeah,
can protect against perhaps things like concussion or
yeah,
even some like acute or short term sleep deprivation. It can sort of buffer against some of the effects there because it provides this short term sort of energy
yeah,
resource. So there's some far reaching health effects from creatine that I think people probably don't appreciate. And therefore, I think pretty much everybody should take it because
yeah,
it's cheap, it's really safe and well studied. And
yeah.
even if it doesn't do too much for you, you're not really missing out on too much by using it.
And how much creatine do you recommend? I know that sometimes people, the bros of the gyms, are loading creatine, and then this. What is your basic recommendation for everyone? If you are recommending it for everyone to take, how should they take it?
Yeah, so basically what we're trying to do is we're trying to saturate our stores of creatine. And so you can load it if you want to saturate those stores really quickly, but personally I find that mega inconvenient. I don't want to be like
Yeah,
drinking water with creatine in it 5 times a day. So I recommend
yeah,
around 3 to 5 grams a day
yep,
every day. And that's pretty much it. And so that's pretty easy. Like if you're already having a shake post workout, or maybe you have some oats or some yogurt for breakfast, you can just
yeah.
mix it into that. Like that's pretty easy to take every
And
day.
they even have pill forms for it as well. And
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
speaking of forms, really quick, there's in the market there's a lot of forms of creatine. And what is your recommended form of creatine that if someone is going into the supplement store to purchase and they see an abundance of it, what should they be looking for when they're purchasing a creatine?
Yeah, monohydrate is probably
Yeah,
the one that we would look for. There are other forms that are effective, but they're a lot more
yeah,
expensive and they're not any better than monohydrate.
yeah.
And if you're looking at a supplement, it might actually say the brand name Creapure on it, which
Hmm.
is a German manufacturer that has a patented manufacturing process
Yeah.
for a high quality version of creatine monohydrate. So a lot of brands use that one. So I would go for that.
Yeah, so save your money. To You don't have to be buying the expensive things. And I think oftentimes, people get intimidated, of course, going into supplement stores thinking that they need every supplement in the store to reach their goals. But at the end of the day, if you really have the basics laid down, and like, you can really do reach your goals in a way that is affordable and sustainable. It does not have to be expensive. Obviously it depends on who you are and your availability and your opportunity to do so, but there are ways to do these in a very affordable manner and to encourage doing it in a sustainable and affordable manner so everybody could be healthy. I think these are little things here and there that we can really prioritize where we're spending our money, and something like this where we're saving some few bucks buying the basic supplements that really help us is the way to go. Now, to wrap up our chat, we asked each of our guests to give 3 things you'd like to share to those in the fitness industry for aspiring coaches and coaches trying to become the best that they could be for their clients. What would be your 3 takeaways?
Yeah, so probably the first one is to go into your coaching relationship viewing it as a partnership, like we've
Mhm.
spoken about. I think um, one of the best things you can do is actually just like help your client understand what they want and then meet
Mhm.
them there, so to
Yeah.
speak, instead of being like, well, yeah, whatever. I'm the
On the
paleo
clock.
guy, and so that's all we do, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of the main thing. I think the other thing that's really important to think about are just spending some time reflecting on your intrinsic values.
Yeah.
By which I mean, sometimes we have some kind of external goal, whether it's to make more money, have a certain amount of clients, have a certain body composition, or whatever it is. And it's no problem having those sort of intrinsic goals. I got
Yeah.
no issue with that at all. But I think sometimes what we have to do is look a little bit further and kind of figure out what is most important to us in terms of our intrinsic values and find a way of reinterpreting those extrinsic goals as intrinsic
Yeah.
value. So, what I mean by that is perhaps you are chasing a certain body composition because what matters to you most in life is a feeling of confidence in yourself.
Yeah.
So, we can kind of reinterpret that extrinsic goal of, well, okay, well, I want to look a certain way and I want to earn a certain amount of money and I want to have a certain social status to align with that. But there's actually a lot of different ways that you can achieve that
Yeah.
intrinsic goal if you want to feel confident. There's a million different things you could do.
Yeah.
And being able to kind of keep the focus on the intrinsic value ends up meaning that you don't get too lost in trying to hit a specific number or
Yeah.
having that value define you. So I think that that's a really important process to go
I
through.
love that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was such a pleasure chatting with you, Luke. Can you let our listeners know where and how they can connect with you, if they're interested in learning more from you, or anybody that is listening who may be interested in working with you? Where can they find you and connect with you?
Yeah, thanks. LukeTulloch.com or at _ Luke Tulloch on Instagram. Those are kind of the two main areas that I'm at.
Awesome. And it was such a pleasure having you guys. Thank you so much for listening to yet another episode. There's always some gems in every episode in ways that you can elevate being the best coach you can be and be the next industry leader. Thank you guys so much for listening.